For those of you who took Leading the Enterprise with Dr. Cho, you know that strategy is one of those words that drives me a little crazy because it's brutally, and I mean brutally abused. But what strategy actually is strategy is a planned series of actions, but you're deploying your advantages to meet a specific goal. The thing about a strategy is you have to have metrics. It has to be measurable and it has to be well defined. So here I'm giving you 3 different situations. One is just about cross-training. One is about a Korean admiral. And the third is about mapping out a tech space. And there's a difference between a strategy and a plan. And if you read through this, only number 2, it's truly a strategy. And that's it. And this is one of the great military stories. Everybody talks about Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar. I think this one was greater, and that's that Admiral Yu was outnumbered 133-13 in terms of ships. But what he did is he took advantage of his situation. He had bigger boats. So what he did is when all these little ships are going, they couldn't handle the turbulence. He had his ships on calm water, and then he just unloaded his cannons at them. Not only that, but he found something, found a quirk in that particular place he chose to fight, and that's at a certain time of day the tides would change direction. And so he had actually battering rams on his big ships, and they just started basically crushing all the little ships. There's actually a really good movie on Netflix, if you don't mind subtitles, that's called The Admiral, which tells this entire story. Very interesting. Anyway, your marketing focus is what you're trying to do, is create a competitive advantage with your strategy. So you need to understand the landscape, plan your moves, identify who is it that you're going after, and then have metrics. And those metrics need to be smart. They have to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. You can't make metrics based on, well, we're going to do the best we can. It's like, that's not a metric. In terms of what you focus on, are you going for value, meaning cost leadership or differentiation? Or are you going after certain markets? Horizontal markets are basically general markets, and vertical markets are very specific. For example, a horizontal market could be cars, and a vertical market could be SUVs. What you're either going for is you're focusing on a certain market, which is like about niches, or you're going for uniqueness. And the thing is, you could be a leader in more than one thing. The thing about Orbit, Priceline, and Expedia, the problem is none of them differentiate themselves, and that's why they're all on equal ground. In terms of the landscape, we've talked about the 5 C's. Now let's talk about the strategic landscape. And basically in formulating a strategy, these are the 5 things that you're interested in. And the first thing we'll talk about is, what kind of market am I going into? Am I going to a static market, one that's not changing a lot? Typically, those are markets that are very mature or near the end of the lifestyle. Dynamic markets have a lot of opportunity because they're growing, they're exciting. The problem is that they're also changing very rapidly. Or am I going for disruption? And digital technology can pretty much disrupt any market. And so when we talk about competition, this is one of the biggest mistakes when people think about competition. People think about competition as being from the viewpoint of the company. That's not your competition. Competition is taken from the viewpoint of the customer. And that makes sense. What are you competing against? You're competing against the customer's options. Who chooses those options? The customer does. And so the thing is, your competition can take place at a lot of different places. And you need to figure out how to formulate a strategy and respond. You have to try to forecast what it is that your competition is going to do. Your direct competitors are enterprises that basically vie with you over the same values that your customer has. Who touches the customer? And so looking at maps, helps you figure out. In terms of competitive landscape is also called a perceptual map. And that's what, it's just some kind of form where you can rapidly see how you stack up against somebody else. It doesn't necessarily need to be graphical. But what it does is it helps you to find the values of your product and how you compare to somebody else. An example is, supposing I'm going to create a new burger chain that's based on you ordering by cell phone. You drive up and get it. So what are some of my values of my burger chain? Well, it's about either being cheap or expensive versus slow versus fast. And so you could see basically my new company Burger Dial is going to be competing against Burger King, McDonald's, companies like that. Here's an example of mapping out competition based on, you pick the most relevant metrics that companies are judged against, and then you do a profile of every company. So that's another approach of doing it. So the process, if I want to do a virtual map, is I have to first pick out my values. And some of those values could be as great as 15. I divide it into quadrants. I populate it on who my competitors are. I pick my space of where my company's going to sit. And then the question is, okay, now I go in there and now I go fight. Okay, now one thing you can do though is you can pick one of those quadrants and then you can break that up into more values and keep breaking out values and values and values. You can keep going forever. And so in terms of competitive scope, you're interested in who are your direct competitors. That's what people mostly think about when they think about competition. So my direct competitor is Burger King. My minor competitor is somebody who does work in the same area that I do, offering hamburgers, but people don't normally associate us together, like Five and Diner and the potential competitors. And so I'm not going to talk about response theory just because that's going to take some time. But for those of you who are interested in game theory or something like that, Prisoner's Dilemma is the classic case of how two companies go at each other and trying to figure out a response. And this is about, should you snitch on each other if you're both criminals, or should you stay silent? And as it turns out, in either case, the optimal response is basically to snitch. Like, if I stay silent versus snitching, if the guy snitches, then and I'm David, well, if I stay silent, I'm looking at 10 years. If I snitch, I'm looking at 5 years. If Matt decides to stay silent and I stay silent, I'm looking at 1 year. But if I snitch, it's 0. So evidently in both cases, I'm better off snitching. And so what I want to do is map out my competitor profile. I want to know who they are. And so these are the things, all these parameters are things that go into a competitor profile. I want to know their strategy, I want to know their capability, and I want to know what their goals are. And so if you're doing research into a competitor, this is what you map out. This is what you look at. I also can do a value chain analysis to see what it is they're due. And there are different sources where I can mine from information. Some of these cost money, some of these you get for free. Annual reports are a good place to find information. And of course on the web, you could do web searching. So summing up competitive analysis, it's about the 5 C's, it's about the strategic landscape, it's about maps. How do I position against my competition? And people also do something called SWOT analysis. Dr. Cho doesn't do it because it's kind of cookie cutter. But that's looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. One of the big weaknesses of SWOT analysis is what's more important, weaknesses or threats? See, there's no way you can tell what the relative value is. So it's just a way of looking at things and summing it up. In the next lecture, we'll start talking about, we'll go on and talk more about the landscape.